Table for two. We have a reservation." The hostess didn't look up right away. She was finishing something on her tablet, scrolling with one finger, unbothered. When she finally raised her eyes and saw the woman standing at the podium, no jewelry worth mentioning, a linen blazer that had seen better days, sensible flats, something in her expression shifted. Not rudely, just the particular kind of recalibration that happens when expectations aren't met. "Last name?" she said. "Caldwell." Another scroll. A pause that lasted a beat too long. "I'm not seeing it." Grace Caldwell didn't flinch. She'd been standing in lobbies like this one her entire adult life. Marble floors, soft lighting, the careful choreography of luxury, and she knew exactly what that pause meant. It wasn't a computer error, it was a read. A split-second verdict delivered without a single word. "Try it under the first name," Grace said. "Or under Hargrove, my husband's account." The hostess typed something. Her posture didn't change. "There it is. Hargrove, party of 2, 7 o'clock. She picked up 2 menus without making eye contact. "Right this way." She led them to a table near the kitchen. Not in the kitchen, technically, but close enough to hear the clatter of dishes being loaded, the swing of the service door every 40 seconds. Grace noted it. She didn't say anything. Her sister Denise sat down and leaned in immediately. "Did she just—" "Yes," Grace said. "Are you going to?" "Not yet." Denise had been watching Grace do this for 30 years. The patience, the deliberate, almost architectural patience that could look, from the outside, like acceptance, like resignation. Denise had never fully understood it. She was the kind of woman who said something. Grace was the kind of woman who waited until what she said could not be walked back. They ordered. The sommelier appeared, young and confident, and addressed himself entirely to the empty chair where Denise's husband would have been sitting if he hadn't cancelled. Grace watched him scan the table, recalibrate, decide to speak slightly over their heads. She selected a bottle. He blinked at her choice. He started. "A very good year," Grace said. "I know." He retreated. Denise raised an eyebrow across the table. "You're enjoying this," Denise said. "I'm really not." But there was something in the way Grace said it. Not sadness, not quite. Something older than that. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been underestimated so many times that the experience no longer surprises her, but never, not once, stops costing her something. The restaurant was called Maison Vérité. It sat on the 42nd floor of the Hargrove Grand Chicago, which was, as it happened, one of 11 hotels that bore the Hargrove name across the United States. Grace's husband, Thomas Hargrove, had built the first one in Nashville when he was 31 years old with a loan and a floor plan he'd sketched on a paper bag. He was 63 now. The company was publicly traded, the flagship property in Chicago. This one, the one with the marble lobby and the hostess with the tablet, had been Grace's idea. She'd chosen the architect. She'd chosen the chef. She'd sat in on 46 design meetings over the course of 2 years and signed off on every piece of furniture in the building. She did not carry a card that said any of this. She didn't feel the need. What Grace carried was a phone that buzzed with a regularity that had annoyed Thomas for years. "Put it away at dinner," he always said. She always tried. Tonight she turned it face down on the tablecloth next to her water glass, and for a while the evening was just what it was supposed to be. 2 sisters. Good food, a bottle of wine that the sommelier had initially doubted her ability to choose. They were halfway through the entrees when the manager came over. He was a man of about 40, well-dressed in the way that managers at properties like this were always well-dressed. Not expensively, but precisely. His name tag said Gerald Fitch, restaurant manager. He stopped at their table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and a posture that Grace had seen before. It was the posture of a man about to deliver a verdict he had already decided on. "Good evening, ladies. I hope you're enjoying your meal." "We are," Grace said. "Thank you." Gerald nodded, but he didn't leave. He picked up the empty breadbasket at the edge of the table, turned it over once in his hands like he needed something to do, and then set it down again. "I wanted to let you know," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, "that we do have a dress code at Maison Vérité. Business casual, at minimum, for dinner service. We usually communicate this when reservations are made, but—" Grace put down her fork. Denise went very still. "In this case it appears there may have been a miscommunication," Gerald continued, "and I want to make sure we maintain the standard our other guests expect. For future visits, I'd want to make sure we're aligned." There was a silence at the table. the kind that has texture. Grace looked at her blazer. It was linen, yes, slightly rumpled from a full day that had started at 6 in the morning with a board call and ended, so far, here. She looked at Gerald Fitch, who was now holding the breadbasket again, and she thought, not for the first time, about what it meant to be a woman who did not look the part that other people had decided she should be playing. "What's the dress code, exactly?" she asked. Gerald seemed to relax slightly, as if her question meant she was engaging with the premise. "Business casual. No athletic wear, no—" "I'm wearing a blazer," Grace said. "Yes, but— and you seated us," she said. "So either the blazer meets your standard or it doesn't." "Which is it?" Gerald's smile flickered, just briefly. "I'm not suggesting you leave, Mrs. Caldwell. I simply wanted to flag it for—" "You flagged it," Grace said. "I heard you." She picked up her fork again. Gerald stood there for one more second, the longest second of his professional evening, though he didn't know it yet, and then he excused himself. Denise watched him go. Then she turned to her sister. "Grace, I know. You're not going to just—" "I said I know, Denise. But here is what Gerald Fitch did not know, and what the hostess did not know, and what the sommelier did not know. The Hargrove Group did not use a corporate credit card for reservations at its own properties. It used family accounts, personal accounts, tied to a single profile that had been created 8 years ago and updated by exactly one person. Grace Caldwell-Hargrove, who had been the chief operating officer of the Hargrove Hospitality Group for 11 years before she stepped back to the advisory board, and who had, in the past 14 months, been quietly and without announcement, serving as its interim chief executive officer while Thomas recovered from surgery. The reservation under Hargrove had not been made by a secretary. It had been made by Grace herself, from her own phone, using her own login. There was no miscommunication. There was only a woman in a linen blazer who didn't look like what people expected when they heard the name on the account. Grace finished her dinner. She had the tarte au citron, which was excellent, and she made a mental note to tell the pastry chef so, because she would be meeting with him in 3 days for a menu review that Gerald Fitch had not been informed of, and would not be informed of until his calendar invitation arrived at 8 o'clock the following morning. She tipped 40%. She always did. In the elevator going down, Denise finally said what she'd been holding since the breadbasket moment. "You're going to do something about this." Grace pressed the button for the lobby. "I already am." "When?" "Already started." Denise looked at her sister, the stillness in her face, the particular quality of calm that other people sometimes mistook for softness, and understood for the first time that what she was looking at was not patience at all, it was precision. Grace did not go home after dinner. She took the elevator to the 38th floor, which was not accessible without a key card registered to a guest room, except that Grace's key card was registered to something else entirely. The executive access profile that Thomas had set up years ago and that Grace had quietly upgraded after he got sick. She walked down a corridor she knew by heart, past a window that looked out over the lake, and let herself into the operations suite, a room that most guests didn't know existed and that most managers used only for fire drill paperwork and scheduling conflicts. She sat down. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the property's service logs for the evening. Table 14, reservation under Hargrove, 7 p.m., party of 2. Seated at 7:04, manager contact at 7:51. Duration of manager interaction, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. There was a camera in the restaurant. Not hidden. The placement was disclosed in the property documentation, but small enough that most people forgot it was there. Grace pulled up the timestamp. She watched Gerald Fitch approach their table. She watched him pick up the breadbasket. She watched him speak to her for 4 minutes and 17 seconds while she sat with her hands in her lap and her expression arranged the way she had learned, over decades, to arrange it. She closed the laptop. She thought about the hostess, the pause, the table near the kitchen, the sommelier who had addressed himself to an empty chair. She thought about every woman who had ever sat at table 14 near the kitchen door and not known who they were, not had a key card for the 38th floor, not had a laptop with access to the service logs. She thought about what happened to those women, which is to say, nothing happened. The breadbasket got picked up, the speech got delivered, the standard got enforced. Selectively, subjectively, in a way that was never quite provable and never quite challenged. And the women in the linen blazers finished their dinners and went home and maybe mentioned it to someone, maybe not. And Gerald Fitch went home too and slept fine. She picked up her phone. She didn't call Thomas. He was recovering, and this wasn't his to carry tonight. She called Olivia Reese. Olivia was the Hargrove Group's Director of Guest Experience, which was a title that undersold what Olivia actually did, which was know everything about every property at any given moment and have an opinion about all of it. She picked up on the second ring. "I'm already awake," Olivia said. "Tell me," Grace told her. Not with anger, not with drama, just the facts, in order, the way she always presented them. The hostess, the table, the sommelier, the manager, the dress code speech, the breadbasket. Olivia was quiet for a moment. "You want me to pull his file," she said. "I want you to pull everyone's file. Front of house, full team. And I want the guest feedback logs for the past 6 months. Specifically any complaints that were filed and closed without escalation." "How many do you think there are?" "I think," Grace said, "that Gerald Fitch has been running this floor the same way for a long time, and nobody has looked closely enough to notice. I think that when I look closely, I'm going to find that tonight wasn't an anomaly." Another silence. Then Olivia said quietly, "Is this about you, or it's not about me?" Grace said, "It never is." She hung up. She sat in the operation suite for another 20 minutes, looking at the lake. Then she went home. The calendar invitation went out at 8 the next morning. Gerald Fitch opened it at 8:17 between his first cup of coffee and a scheduling call with the breakfast crew. It was a simple meeting request. Guest experience review, Maison Vérité, Friday, 10 a.m. Attendees: G. Fitch, restaurant manager; A. Park, front of house lead; M. Torres, sommelier supervisor; and Grace Caldwell-Hargrove, interim CEO, Hargrove Hospitality Group. Gerald read it twice. Then he read the name Hargrove. He put down his coffee. He pulled up the reservation log from the previous evening. Hargrove, party of 2, table 14. He sat very still for a moment in the way that people sit still when they are replaying a conversation and hearing it differently than the first time. The breadbasket, the dress code. For future visits, I'd want to make sure we're aligned. He picked up the phone and called the hostess from last night. She didn't answer. He called the sommelier. Voicemail. He thought about calling someone above him, but there was no one above him at this property except the general manager, and the general manager reported to the regional VP, and the regional VP reported, ultimately, to the CEO, who had been sitting at table 14 last night with a slightly rumpled blazer and a glass of the 2019 Montrachet, and had not said a single word to him that wasn't exactly, precisely true. The Friday meeting lasted 90 minutes. Grace sat at the head of the conference table with Olivia Reese to her right and a printed summary of 6 months of guest feedback to her left. The summary was 43 pages. Olivia had color-coded it. Gerald Fitch sat across the table. Ava Park, the front-of-house lead, sat beside him. The sommelier supervisor had called in sick, which was a choice that everyone in the room understood perfectly well. Grace did not open with the previous Tuesday. She opened with the data. 11 guest complaints in 6 months. 11 complaints about front-of-house interactions, tone, table placement, attentiveness that had been logged, reviewed by Gerald, and closed internally without escalation to guest experience. 3 of those complaints mentioned feeling unwelcome. 2 mentioned the dress code being selectively applied. 1 was a 7-paragraph email from a woman who had been seated near the kitchen on a Saturday night and had later identified herself, in a follow-up call to the main guest line, as a federal judge. Grace read that last one aloud. She read it without editorial, without raising her voice, without looking at Gerald. She just read it the way you read a document, when you want everyone in the room to understand that it exists, that it was written, that it was received, and that it was closed with a form response and no further action. When she finished, the room was very quiet. The Hargrove brand, Grace said, setting down the papers, is built on a specific promise. Not to guests who look a certain way, not to guests who arrive wearing certain things, to every guest who walks through the door. She looked at Gerald then. That's not a courtesy. It's not a suggestion. It's the entire architecture of what we built here. And when it fails, not because a team member made a mistake, but because a pattern was allowed to develop and never corrected, that's a leadership problem. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. I'm not here to fire you today, Grace said. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because this property is exceptional in a dozen ways, and I believe the people in this room are capable of making it exceptional in the remaining ones. She looked at Ava Park, who had been silent and very still since the meeting began. But I need you to understand that what happened Tuesday night was not a one-time error. It was the visible tip of something that has been building, and I saw it, and now we all see it, and from this point forward the standard is different. She paused. Do we understand each other? Gerald Fitch looked at the table. Then he looked up. Yes, ma'am, he said. It was the first time since Tuesday that anyone in this building had used that word. The restructuring of Maison Vérité's front-of-house protocol took 8 weeks. New training, new complaint escalation standards, a guest feedback system that reported directly to Olivia's office instead of being reviewed internally. Grace attended 2 of the training sessions. She sat in the back. She did not introduce herself by title. On the last day of the second session, one of the newer hostesses, maybe 22, nervous, taking careful notes, raised her hand and asked, "What do you do when you're not sure? When someone comes in and you genuinely can't read the situation and you don't want to make an assumption?" Grace leaned forward from the back of the room. "You treat them like the most important guest you've ever seated," she said. "Every single time. Not because they might be, because that's the job." The hostess wrote it down. Grace watched her write it down and thought about the woman who would sit at the next table, 14 near the kitchen door. Or wouldn't, because maybe now there wouldn't be a table near the kitchen door that got used for certain guests and not for others. Maybe now the breadbasket would just be a breadbasket. Maybe. She didn't put her name on the training materials. She didn't need credit for it. What she needed, what she had always needed, was for it to actually work. 3 months later, Maison Vérité received the highest guest satisfaction score in the Hargrove portfolio. It was the first time a Chicago property had topped the quarterly rankings in 4 years. Gerald Fitch sent Grace a handwritten note, 3 sentences. He said he understood now what he hadn't understood before. He said the word sorry without any qualifications attached to it. He said he was grateful. Grace read it twice. Then she put it in a drawer. Denise called that weekend the way she called every weekend. "So?" she said. "So what? You know what? Did it work? Did anything actually change?" Grace thought about the hostess writing in her notebook. She thought about the federal judge's 7-paragraph email that had finally been answered. A real answer, not a form response, 6 months late but genuine. She thought about the 43 pages and what it meant that no one had read them until she did. "Something changed," she said. "Is that enough?" Grace looked out the window. The lake was gray today, the kind of gray that means weather coming, and she watched a boat cross far in the distance, small and steady, taking its time. "Ask me that again in a year," she said, "and the year after that." Because the thing about changing a standard, really changing it, not just saying the words, is that it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a grand gesture or a moment that can be captured in a photograph. It accumulates, guest by guest, interaction by interaction, hostess writing in a notebook and actually meaning it. It was slow work. Grace had always known that. She had also always known she was better at slow work than people expected. If you're watching this, and you've ever been seated near the kitchen door, if you've ever been talked to like you couldn't possibly understand the wine list, or had someone pick up a bread basket and tell you what your clothes said about your worth, I want you to know something. The people who did that to you were wrong. Not rude, not just having a bad day. Wrong. And most of them will never sit in a room with 43 pages and have to see what they built, one closed complaint at a time. But some of them will. Grace didn't ground a fleet. She didn't make a call that echoed through a building in real time. What she did was quieter and, in some ways, harder. She sat down at the table, literally, the same table, and she stayed. She stayed until the numbers changed, until the training happened, until a 22-year-old hostess wrote down, "Treat them like the most important guest you've ever seated," and actually believed it. That's not a movie moment, but it's the real one. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked right through you? I want to know. And if you're new here, welcome to Velvet Verdict. We tell the stories that don't get told loudly enough. Subscribe. We're just getting started.